Welcome, GEW students, to the lesson on textual analysis. Today I'm going to be talking about textual analysis, which is what you're going to be doing in your letter to the professor this week. And it's the basis of understanding text so that you can produce them more effectively. You may remember I explained that in my discipline, we believe that thinking about what other people are doing when they write helps us understand our own writing better. So textual analysis gets us to think about other texts so we can make our own texts more effective. You may hear textual analysis called rhetorical analysis, or you may hear it called literary analysis. All of these types of analysis are ultimately asking the same question, though they have different genre expectations about how to answer that question. The question that we are ultimately trying to answer then is, what message does the text communicate? That's what we're trying to figure out. All types of analysis ultimately come back to that question. In support of that question is the second question that textual analysis answers, which is, how does the text communicate the message? So once we figured out what message the text communicates, then we want to look at how the text communicates that message. And to do that, we consider all the components of the text, whether it's a book or a poem or a television show or a billboard. And we'll look at the how in the next video.
So here, we're going to focus on what message does the text communicate. In particular, a text is using language to tell someone something. Like, even if you're writing a text for yourself, like a journal, it still is a communication between a reader, or a writer and a reader and a writer. There's this dialogue, there's a communication between them. That's what a text is, whether the text is a piece of literature, a book, whether the text is a film, whether the text is a journal. All written things are texts, and many visual things are texts,
as we learned last week.
And it's the text that I keep emphasizing, not the author or the director or the writer, even though those people are important. They obviously make the text, but the author's intention, you can't mix that up with the text itself, right? The author may or may not intend for you to understand things in a particular way, but once that text exists, once you've written the text and then given it to the world, it exists outside of the author, it exists outside of you, and people interpret it in their own way that you may or may not have intended for them to interpret it. So we look at the text, what the text does, not what the author wanted it to do. We may know that, and that may be a good thing, but the text itself is what we're concerned with here, and the text exists separate from the author once it's sort of released from the author.
With visual texts, it was things like color and line and shape that we looked at. With written texts, it's the language that we're going to pay attention to the most.
So the text's language is how that message gets developed. And we're going to talk a lot more about how in the next video. So when a text communicates a message, not just an idea, and this is really important, this is kind of the focus of the rest of this video. It makes a statement or a claim about the idea. So love is not
a message.
You'll see people say the theme of the text is love. No, that's the topic of the text. What claim does the text make about love? Love sucks. Love is the most important thing in the world and you should sacrifice your life for it. Love is best when it's balanced. Like, what claim about love is true?
That claim is the message.
So the answer to the question, what message does the text communicate, I call an argument or a thesis or an interpretation. That's you. That's what you have decided you think the text means. And that's going to be unique to each person. Each person might see something slightly different in the text. That's totally normal. We each bring with us stuff that affects how we interpret. And so we're just going to have our own interpretation. That's fine as long as you can support it with evidence. All right, so an argument doesn't explain what happens. That's called a summary. Instead, it explained why that happens and what it means that it happens. And what I mean by what it means is, what message does that send?
So we've already talked about the two questions that are always answered by textual analysis, but sometimes there's a third question. Sometimes in some types of analysis, you'll be asked to evaluate how effectively the text actually produces that message. We did that a little bit last week with the visual text. I asked you, was it persuasive or not? Did you believe it? In fact, you did most of this last week in your discussion of the visual text. You developed a thesis, in essence, because you were telling me what the message of the text was, and you were focused on how it communicated that message, and how effective those choices were or were not. And you'll do the same thing this week with a written text instead of a visual one.
Stay tuned for the next video on how does the text communicate that message.